Our Bible word is Colossians 1 verse 16. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. So here we have an early Christian hymn, and it's also known as the Colossians hymn. And here we have the Apostle Paul. He's writing this epistle to Christians in Colossae, and this happened while he was on his third missionary journey. And we can read about that in Acts, from Acts 18 to Acts 21, and eventually landed up in Ephesus. And here Paul stayed for about 2 to 3 years. And it looks like he was also imprisoned here. And because if you read later, or in later epistles, for example in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, about that he was imprisoned, etc. So we're not told this very clearly, for example in the book of Acts, but the epistle to Colossians is one of Paul's captivity epistles. And there's 4 that Paul wrote from prison, or while he was under house detention, etc. And these are Philemon and Colossians, and there's also Ephesians and Philippians. These are referred to as Paul's captivity epistles. Now, some scholars would date Colossians to this time period when Paul was in Ephesus, his Ephesian imprisonment. So that would date to around 54, 55 AD. Other scholars would date it to Paul's later imprisonment. That's when he was in Rome, under house arrest in Rome. That's roughly 60 to 62 AD. And some scholars would also say, because this epistle has so many new words, it looks like somebody else wrote this letter. Somebody wrote it after the time of Paul, one of his students, or one of those belonging to the Pauline school. But the approach that we will take here is that Paul wrote this, or probably he got somebody to write it on his behalf, because there's this new words, this new grammar, new style that we encounter also in Colossians. Maybe it was Epaphras or Timothy who wrote this letter on behalf of Paul, because Paul also towards the end, he gives this personal conclusion, or he adds his personal note to this epistle. We find this there in chapter 4 verses 18. If we go read it there, this salutation by my own hand, Paul, remember my chains, grace be with you, amen. So maybe Epaphras or Timothy wrote this letter on behalf of Paul. Then Paul went through this letter and also then gave his final, added his own salutation towards the epistle towards the end. So that's the approach that we will take here. So it's written by Paul while he was in prison in Ephesus. We cannot be 100% sure about this. Roughly 54 to 55 AD. And he was in prison also with this guy called Epaphras, like I mentioned his name before. And Epaphras was actually the person who founded the Christian community in Colossae. And he probably also founded the Christian community in Laodicea. Now Laodicea and Colossae, these two cities were situated quite close to each other, and they were situated in the Lycus Valley. That's where the Lycus River ran down. And because we also read that Paul also wrote another epistle to the Laodiceans. That's in 4 verses 16. If we go read there, Paul writes, now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. So obviously Paul, he did not just write this epistle to the Colossians here, but also to congregations in Laodicea. And he did not establish these congregations. It was probably this Epaphras that we also read here. If you go read there in chapter 1, verses 7, there Paul or the author writes there, as you also learned from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. So it was this Epaphras who founded these Christian congregations in Colossae and probably also in Laodicea. And now Paul came to hear of trouble facing these congregations. And in the valley of the Lycus, or the Lycus Valley, there were very, very strong Jewish communities already established. So maybe these opponents or troubling the Christians in Colossae and Laodicea, they were maybe Jews. We cannot to be sure about this, but the indications in the epistle is that they were influenced by Jewish teachers or people from the synagogue. Because many Christians at this time, they still went to the synagogue. Because at this time, Christianity and Judaism, it was still kind of under the same umbrella. So maybe there was some here, or some Jews who influenced them, and also suggesting that Christ, well, is not enough. That there's more spiritual riches to be attained somehow. And these opponents, Paul actually calls their teaching a philosophy. If we go there to chapter 2, verses 8, Paul writes there, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. So they're giving another teaching. What Paul, the author, writes here, he calls it a philosophy. Now the author also continues and says in verse 9, for in him, that's Christ, dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him, who is the head of all principality and power. So it's saying that Christ, everything you need is in Christ. In him the fullness of the Godhead dwells. This is the most complete revelation of God. You don't need to go anywhere else to know anything. So these troublemakers, these opponents, or people that come to upset these Christians, like I said, they were probably Jews from the local synagogue. And the reason we say this is because if we go read chapter 2, verses 16, Paul says there, so let no one judge you in food, or in drink, or regarding a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbaths. And also in other parts of Colossians, Paul writes about that. He says they observe a special diet because they say don't eat, don't touch, etc. And that they must abstain. And there's also this concern maybe for purity laws. Also for law observance, if you go read there, chapter 2, verses 14. And here and there, like in places like chapter 2, verse 11, verses 18, also in chapter 3, Paul writes about circumcision. Specifically, if we go to chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. Paul writes there about this having put on the new man in Christ. And this, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. And another thing is, because these troublemakers, they propose this physical abstinence and do not touch, do not taste, etc., it might also suggest they were engaged or claimed to engage in mystical practices and worshipping with the angels. Because Paul also, or the author writes there in chapter 2, verses 18, let no one cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. So it seems that they claim to engage in mystical practices where they go and ascend, make these mystical ascents and worship with the angels, so to speak. So we maybe have to do with a group of Jewish mystics or people who claim to are engaged with mystical practices. And they are saying, yeah, we find more. This is more better knowledge of God. Here you are more spiritual. Here you are better. And the author here, also Paul, with Paul's sanction, saying, no, that's nonsense. In Christ, you have everything. Everything you need. And that is also our Bible word. It comes from this. This is a hymn of praise to Christ. And that's our textual unit. We will look at chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. This is this hymn of praise to Christ. So let's go through it. Just take note that there's two strophes to this hymn. There is verses 15 to 18a. That's the first half of verse 18. And then verses 18b to 20. We'll see that the first half deals with Christ's preeminence in creation. And then the second strophe focuses on Christ's preeminence in redemption. So let's go to verses 15. He is the image of the invisible God. This is now speaking of Christ, the firstborn over all creation. So how does God make himself known? There was this wide-held belief that God is invisible. You cannot see him. So how does God reveal himself? How does God make himself known? How does God relate with creation? And for many early Jewish wisdom literature, it was that was the role of divine wisdom, or the law, Torah. That is how God has revealed himself. And here also, Jesus is in this tradition of divine wisdom. He is identified as divine wisdom. He's also identified as this divine law, Torah. This is how the invisible God has revealed himself, has made himself known. So he's the image, in other words, the representation of God, or the likeness, or the reflection of God. This is who Jesus is. He is the firstborn over all creation. Referring to Christ is preeminent over creation. If we go to verses 2, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. So, in the Jewish wisdom tradition, God created the world through wisdom, or divine wisdom. Here again, Jesus is identified with this wisdom figure. It is Christ through whom everything was created. And we must also understand the ancient understanding of the cosmos. Normally the word cosmos in the Greek is translated as world in our English Bibles, but the word, or the Greek word cosmos, had a very specific meaning. It was believed that the cosmos at that time had Earth at its center, and they had these various spheres that surrounded the Earth. There were planetary spheres, also the sphere of the sun, and think of it as like soccer balls contained within soccer balls, going smaller and smaller. And that's how they moved around the Earth, fixed in their spheres around the Earth. And then beyond the spheres, there's the astral level of the stars, and then beyond that is where God is, or Aristotle's unmoved mover, the one that initiates movement in the cosmos. And so the cosmos is hierarchically arranged. It's a rational thing. It's specifically been ordered. And in these various planetary spheres, there's also angelic beings or demonic beings. In other words, angels who have become opposed to God's will. And closer to the earth, there are terrestrial demons, etc. So think of the cosmos as this elaborate order of things, these spheres within spheres that has been arranged. And somewhere there are the angels in the astral level. Then there's like these demons, etc. Closer to the earth, there are the terrestrial angels or terrestrial demons. And at the center of this was the earth. And this is what Paul is referring to here. This beautiful cosmos as it was understood back then. And Christ was the one who created this elaborate order, this beautiful order of the cosmos. As it says here, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth. So Paul refers here to the invisible realm and the visible realm. Also the outer realms of the cosmos that were seen as both physical and spiritual at the same time. So visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. Yeah, Paul's referring to these angelic realms, even these realms of the demons, etc., or evil or angels opposed to God. Christ even created this, but now they are in rebellion, because now Christ has also defeated them. He's also in charge of them. But importantly, all things were created through Him, that's Christ, and for Him. Now if we go to verse 17, and He is before all things, and in Him all things consist. So in other words, Christ is the sustainer of the cosmos. It's because of Him that everything in the cosmos continues to exist, whether it be earth, whether it be the heavenly, the planetary realms, and everything within it. Christ sustains the whole cosmos. He is preeminent in creation, because everything exists by Him, through Him, for Him, etc. And in the ancient world, this cosmos was also understood to be a body. And now our transition nearly begins if we read in verse 18, and He is the head of the body. So yeah, it can also refer to the cosmos, but now it's also applied to the church. The church is also a cosmos, so to speak. And He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things He may have the preeminence. This is important, that in all things that He may have preeminence. As Christ is preeminent creation, He is also preeminent in redemption. He is the head of the church. He is the firstborn in terms of He was the first one to rise from the dead. And now in verses 19 it says, for it pleased the Father that in Him all the fullness should dwell. In other words, in Christ, the full revelation of God was given. If you want to know God, come to know Christ. You don't have to go worship with the angels like these troublemakers are saying. In Christ we have everything that we need. And also importantly, in verse 20, and by Him to reconcile all things to Himself. By Him. In other words, God the Father used Christ, the firstborn from the dead, to also reconcile the whole cosmos, everything in the cosmos, to Himself. Whether things on earth or things in heaven, those planetary spheres, etc. Having made peace through the blood of His cross. So the death of Jesus, the sacrificial death of Jesus, brought about this redemption, this forgiveness of sins, this reconciliation. Somehow the heavenly beings in the cosmos is in opposition to God. Of course also human sin. Humans who are influenced and also ruled to a degree by these evil heavenly beings. They also rebelled against God. But through Christ, Christ has redeemed everything in the cosmos. Now let's just look again at these two strophes of this hymn in Colossians. Again, there's two strophes. There's verses 15 to 18a, and then verses 18b to 20. The first strophe is about Christ being preeminent in creation. And then the second strophe is about Christ being preeminent in redemption. So it's about creation and recreation, or the beginning and the completion. So that's the balance of this beautiful hymn. And maybe one of our authors or our composers can maybe compose a beautiful piece of music to this hymn. It's Christ, He's preeminent in creation, He's preeminent in redemption. He was involved in the beginning, He's now also involved in the completion. And this is our hymn to Christ that our Bible word is also taken from.